And good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are at this current state of time. My name is Ben Quina, and we are commencing with episode 2 of the Unveiling the Civil War, a Civil War podcast with a living historian's twist. This is our second episode. I'm joined by my compatriots, Dylan Obney and Ben Flowerday, and we're very excited to be with you all today after our first episode, which was a resounding success. Millions of followers grabbed
I
onto it.
hear it's gone viral.
It's
I
gone
hear it's the
viral.
greatest podcast of all time and that everybody's enjoying it. And
It's been
we are here to serve you people. We are very glad to do it. Yes.
We
an
are in the double
absolutely great.
digits in listens on Spotify
So
officially.
Yeah.
we have our own YouTube channel, we have a Facebook page, and we are really rolling in the dough. So anyway, we appreciate anybody that watches, but we're going to reintroduce the three of us just briefly, real quickly before we start into kind of what we're going to be doing today. So I'll start real quickly. My name is Ben Quina. I'm a Civil War reenactor with the 12th South Carolina, 4th Michigan Volunteer Infantry. I've been reenacting for about 31 years. I'm an attorney in my real life with one son, and just love studying the Civil War. Love putting it together with the reenacting aspect of it. I'm more of an Eastern Theater, Army of Northern Virginia person of interest, with a specific focus on the Light Division, AP Hill's Light Division, specifically, McGowan's South Carolina Brigade. I've started and completed writing a book on the 12th South Carolina Regiment, which will be published next year, hopefully by Savas Beatty. And
That's exciting.
looking forward to that. And just love studying the Civil War, getting more into the first person accounts now, going right to the primary sources, which I think is very interesting. So that's kind of my background. And I'll pass it off here to our friend Dylan Obney.
Thank you, Master Quina. My man is really just so glad to be doing with this with someone of your level here. I mean, I aspire to have a bookshelf like that in my background one day. Yeah, my name's Dylan Obney. Been reenacting for about 13 years now. I'm 24 years old. I was born in California, moved to Tennessee to the city of Savannah and lived basically right on the Shiloh battlefield. That's where my spark for my passion for history started, and just been rolling with it ever since. Moved back to California, joined the 2nd Florida Infantry Reenactment Regiment, and been with them for about 11 years. And then we started doing our own group called the Independent Western Rifles, where we focus more on our own immersive events and just bringing a level of authenticity that's not really around in California that much, and trying to change that. But yeah, really just love studying the Civil War. Obviously, being with a Florida unit for so long, my focus has been in Perry's Brigade and the Floridians, obviously mostly the 2nd Florida, but the 5th and the 8th as well, and the 1st and 3rd of the Western Theater Armies a little bit, not so much, but mostly a big as well Eastern Theater guy. Love studying about the Gettysburg campaign. I mean, it's, in my opinion, you can be an expert on the Civil War and you can be an expert on Gettysburg, and those are two different things right there. And I'm trying to eventually work towards the latter right there. But there's just so much to talk about. It's never ending. Never stop learning about this stuff, and that's kind of why we're here. And I'm just excited to keep going with this. Like Quina was saying, that we've gone full in. We got a YouTube, Facebook, Spotify, everything now, just to try to get these conversations out as much as possible. And I hope everyone's going to enjoy it. I think today's topic is going to be really interesting. I spent the bulk of yesterday really diving into this stuff, and I'm excited to see what everyone has to bring to the table.
All right, Ben? Thank you. And for the record, we said that we would be bringing a item from our reenacting lives today. I'm with my old tin cup here, which is about 31 years old. What do you have on today, Dylan? Could you explain?
I love that your cup is older than I am. But this is my Western Fed kit. I'll be wearing the Chickamauga 160th this year, so if anyone's down there, come say hi. But this is a old Charlie Childs jacket that I actually got on the tray blanket. Really high quality maker, all hand done. Then I have my contract variant gray shirt underneath, Honestberg. This is a Wamba white shirt, I believe. And then this hat is a Avery Miller made civilian black hat, just a wide brim slouch hat. And yeah, really all high quality makers. Give a shout out to all those guys. If you're looking for good, high quality, authentic kit, those are definitely good people to start. Wamba and White, Avery Miller, Charlie Childs, and then obviously the authentic campaigner, Trade Blanket, all great places to source gear. Also want to give a quick shout out to Essential Curriculum, the Civil War Essential Curriculum website. I don't know if any of you have looked at that, but there's just a ton of really, really good essays and collections of after action reports and stuff easily accessible on there. So Essential Civil War Curriculum, if you haven't checked it out, go ahead and check that out.
Thank you. And we have Ben Flowerday.
All right. Well, good afternoon, morning, evening, early dawn, whatever time it may be. My name is Ben Flowerday. I'm also 24 years old. I've been reenacting for almost 10 years. I'm wrapping up my 9th year here this fall. So next spring will be my 10th anniversary. Believe it or not, I met Ben Quino when I was a spry 14-year-old high school freshman, and he is largely responsible for my involvement in the hobby, at least initially. I'm sorry to make you aware of that fact now. As such, I also generally have kind of latched onto the McGowan's Brigade, the Eastern Theater. But my focus in terms of military campaigns has especially recently been the Overland Campaign. So the spring of 1864 in Virginia has been something that I've really dove into head first, studying Lee versus Grant and kind of the beginning of the last year of fighting out east. I'm also very, very interested in uniforms and equipment, obviously being involved in living history. That's a huge aspect of what we do, is accurately at least acquiring good reproductions, wearing them, figuring out the context and how one particular soldier might end up with the clothing and gear that he has. So speaking of clothing and gear, my piece of kit, I'm not wearing full kit. It is a fairly warm, humid day out there, and I'm actually in the middle of packing for an event this weekend, so some of it's packed away. But I'm wearing this hat. This is a copy of a British import hat, slouch hat, the Confederacy was contracting through from England. And it is a very controversial piece because I have included a hat cord.
I was about to say, I see you are
hat cord season.
The line there.
I have a hat cord on it. But specifically this hat, I did that intentionally. There's a relatively famous picture of a dead Confederate outside of the Spotsylvania earthworks where he's lying on the ground, and next to him is a black British import hat with a hat cord. So I pretty much specifically
you made that
hat.
Up.
All right.
Yeah, you're right. I have zero sources. I've never looked at anything
made that
original.
Right up.
Hat cords didn't exist. Not only is this a hat cord too, I don't know how well it comes through on the screen. It's not actually a federal dress hat cord. It's a dark indigo dyed, Confederate copy. So it's not I'm not just throwing a Hardy hat cord on my British hat here. This is pretty intentional.
Unacceptable.
Well,
hopefully I won't get yelled at on the reenactors page, but I stand by my decisions.
I'm gonna be a little bit controversial too. I have a tin cup that is darkened and blackened. So
I know that
I know that's
they would never have done that.
That's a big issue out there. So it is darkened, it's blackened. I have had it for about 31 years.
You've cooked in it, you've put it over a fire.
I bathed in it. So
I mean, I know you're short. I didn't know you could fit into a cup.
Well, what I do is I will put water in it, heat it up, and I will use it to wash my face in the morning.
Okay. You don't jump in like bathtub style.
I am short, but not that short. So I know that's a little bit controversial too. So we can get into some topics next time, maybe. But all right. Well, as we said, thank you, Ben. As we said, our podcast is going to look at all aspects of the Civil War with a living historian's twist. So we'll be doing some episodes on the war, the battle, the campaigns, the leaders, the what ifs. We'll also be looking at various topics in the Civil War reenacting hobby, which is always interesting, always rife with controversy and drama and all of those things that happened in the real war with the real generals, even in the post-war. So we'll be looking at some of those really interesting topics down the road. So, but alas, what is our topic for today? Our second episode, we're going to be discussing and reviewing turning points of the Civil War. And what we've done is we have asked each of our contributors to come up with their top three. So we'll go from 3 to 1. Each man will give his top three with a 4 to 5 minute speech or spiel on why he thinks that individual one is important. So each of us will have about 15 minutes to talk about our three. And then we'll have kind of a roundtable discussion on what we thought of those decisions, and roundtable discussion on what we thought of those decisions to make those turning points themselves, as well as maybe discuss maybe our honorable mentions as well. So, so with that, we're just going to kind of dive in. We're going to start with Mr. Flowerday today. And he's going to start with his three turning points. And again, we're going to go from the third, second, and what you believe is the primary turning point will be your last one. Okay.
Oh, okay. So you don't want chronological order then?
Well, I guess you can do it any way you want. I was thinking we could go in what we thought was the most important, but we can certainly do it chronological if you want.
Yeah.
What if
if you
what if your chronological is from least to most important?
Yeah, you can do both.
Mine are so different. It's hard to put emphasis on. But so if you don't mind, I think I'm going to do chronological order just because it's very.
You do you,
it makes
buddy.
the most sense.
You do you.
So a little bit of background for how I picked mine. I had a fairly tough time narrowing it down. But what I looked at was what event or events is going to lead to if you take the war from a lens that the Confederacy needs to last long enough to make the Northerners sick of fighting the war and abandon the war effort, that was probably their best chance of winning. And the turning points that led to that is kind of what I used to that's kind of the lens that I used to pick the turning points. So first turning point, and this might be a little bit surprising, but it's actually the Battle of First Manassas, or Bull Run. And I think that that's a really important part of the war because prior to Bull Run, no one knew the scope of what the war was going to look like. In fact, when all the volunteers were called up, for the most part, they were 90-day volunteers, basically treating this as a temporary insurrection. Lincoln was going to send down the state's volunteers to tamp down this insurrection, and that's all it was. That was the most that this war was ever going to be. But the fact that the Confederacy equally organized an army, and a fairly effective one at that, and pretty much embarrassed the Union insurrection killers at Bull Run, kind of was the first signal that the Confederate government had the potential to be a legitimate entity, and it was going to be a clear indication that the war was not going to be as quick as anyone thought it was. So right off the bat, in July of 1861, everyone's idea of the scope of the war is going to change. And then again, from the Confederacy's perspective, for a second, they thought that if they won that battle, that would be it. The Unionists would go running back to Washington, say the fight's not worth fighting. But I think it strengthened the resolve of both sides to really start to act as countries fighting each other at war rather than a brief temporary rebellion. So first Battle of Bull Run, you also have some of the heroes coming out of there, Stonewall Jackson, of course, and it leads to the beginning of the creation and the organization of the armies. The next turning point that I have listed is it's the death of Albert Sidney Johnston at Shiloh. Now, this is a turning point, in my opinion, because he was probably after Lee, well, really before Lee, but he was one of the most promising Confederate Army commanders, Army field commanders that the Confederacy had access to. And he was organizing all of the troops out west. He had a fairly clear strategy to deal uh, with Grant in the Mississippi, and he was going to be the guy that was organizing Western armies. And after he was killed at Shiloh, the command devolved, and you really never see those armies recover in terms of command staff. You have Bragg and Johnston, and with one of the major goals of the Confederacy being having effective field armies out in the field and not retreating and basically being aggressive and being a thorn in the side of the Union. That's what's going to help them turn Northern favor against the war. And as soon as you have commanders that are essentially giving the Union hope all of the time, which you then have in the Western theater, you're going to start to have some issues there. So Albert Sidney Johnston, it's a big what if, obviously, because of how early in the war it happened. You can't say that he was going to be perfect or even succeed to the level that we think or the Confederacy hoped he might have. But it is very clear that the subordinates did not necessarily handle the West very well. And very quickly after 1862, you just have a string of disasters to somewhat Pyrrhic victories. I mean, you have the failed invasion of Kentucky in 1862. 1863, you lose Vicksburg. Chickamauga is a victory, but then Chattanooga stalls out. Grant's able to break free, and from there, the Western armies are just never really able to recover from what happened there. And then the third turning point that I have, now this one is in chronological, or in, I think is also the largest, but that is the appointment of Ulysses S. Grant as General-in-Chief of the United States armies in March of 1864. For so many reasons, but I think the biggest one is you have to look at the Eastern Theater as the primary theater of the war. I know that sounds biased, it sounds mainstream, but the fact of the matter is those are the two largest armies, and they're fighting within, for the most part, 100 miles of Washington, D.C. So that's what the people who are making the decisions, who are contributing to votes, to politics, they're seeing what's happening primarily in the Eastern Theater. Also, the most populous states, New York, Pennsylvania, are sending most of their men to the Eastern Theater. So the casualties and the victories are hitting harder there than in other areas necessarily. And so when Grant becomes general-in-chief, he is the first general in the Eastern Theater to understand kind of the task at hand. McClellan, Hooker, they all were trying for these victories. They were all campaigning against Richmond. Grant had this idea that Richmond was a secondary objective and that the primary objective was to destroy Lee's army, because as long as Lee's army was in the field, the Confederacy had hope, had that chance. And so Grant basically understood that he had all of the power in the world at his disposal to go after Lee, and Lee specifically. And what you see there is, starting in May of 1864, Grant going after Lee almost every day for an entire year. And that is what it took. And I don't think that anyone other than Grant really had the balls to do that, essentially. He was one of the few generals in the East that woke up and thought it's a good day to fight instead of it's a good day to retreat or plan or try to execute a flanking maneuver, make sure every wagon is exactly the right place before we take a step forward. His primary motivating factor was finding Lee, destroying the army, and turning the Northern favor into one that they realized that this is a winnable war and that it doesn't have to drag on forever.
Great.
Do you want the honorable mention now or
I say
later?
let's wait. Let's wait on that.
Okay, we'll wait on the honorable mentions.
Okay. So for Ben Flower Day, we have the Battle of First Manassas, the death of Albert Sidney Johnston at Shiloh, and the March 1864 appointment of Grant as General in Chief of United States Armies as his three primary turning points that point to Union victory in the war. All right. Very good. Mr. Obney, your three.
All right. Nice job, Ben.
Yes.
I'm glad someone else was thinking outside the box as well and didn't kind of just go with the basic Gettysburg,
I
Chancellorsville, and Vicksburg.
I think
but
this I don't know. I don't think you get very much inside the box thinking with the three of us here. I feel like the
nope.
competition was to outdo each other with creativity
Yeah.
here.
Well, I like that we all didn't tell anybody like what our three were going to be. We didn't share any research. We just went ahead and did this, and I think
Right.
that's what's going to make this really interesting right here. So
Yeah.
I'm going to get right into it and start with my first point. I'm going to be also similar to Ben along the lines that mine are chronological, but it's also, I think, as you get farther down the war, every decision becomes more and more important. So
That's a good
naturally,
start.
it's going to go from, you have more time to fix problems to less time and less time. So it's going to become least important to most important naturally. My first point is going to be the Trent Affair, November 8th,
Woo!
1861.
Oh,
So this is obviously after Battle of First Manassas, after the war has been going. There's been several defeats for the Union Army at this point, and there are not a lot of high morale at this point for support of the war or in the Northern armies themselves. They find themselves lost between different commanders and kind of losing faith in battles they should have won and things like that. But so here we go. So the Trent Affair is November in 1861. Basically, Jefferson Davis decides to send envoys to France and England seeking full diplomatic recognition as a sovereign nation and not just as a belligerent power in this war against the U.S. France and England have kept their allegiances to the United States, and where they recognize the South as, they are fighting for their independence. They haven't really recognized them as a sovereign nation yet. And so Davis, seeking that as well as lucrative trade opportunities with European countries, decides to send two people, James Mason and John Slidell. Mason, the chairman of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Slidell is a prominent New Orleans lawyer, good friends with Davis. Both guys are extremist, anti-union, pro-secession guys and are very well known in the North, and obviously very much disliked in the North. But Davis hopes to lend credibility to Southern independence through recognition of foreign powers, and he decides to send them as envoys to England and France. And so in October 12th, 1861, Mason and Slidell board the CSS Theodora and escape the Union blockade in Charleston, South Carolina, get to Cuba, and they board the British mailing ship, the Trent, where they were bound for England. And at the same time, Captain Charles Wilkes of the U.S. Navy disobeys his orders to go to participate in the assault in Port Royal in South Carolina, and decides to, after he hears about that Mason and Slidell were coming to Cuba, and decides to lay in wait off of the coast of Cuba. And on November 8th, he intercepts them by sending two warning shots across the bow, causing the Trent to hove to. And he orders his lieutenant to board the ship and search it, and without first obtaining permission from Washington. The U.S. boarding party then takes Mason and Slidell, their secretaries, as prisoners and allow the Trent to sail away to England. And that was kind of the problem right there, because what they should have done, and what they were later chastised for, was that they didn't take the Trent a prize and take her to a court to be affirmed for the legality of taking contraband as prisoners. So Britain gets really, really mad about this. Britain becomes very upset that the U.S. is basically doing the same thing that Britain was doing before the War of 1812, kind of similar to the impressment of U.S. sailors. And while the U.S. celebrated the seizure as a blow to rebel diplomatic relations, Britain really viewed it as an active violation of peace treaties and trade diplomacy, and that it was totally breaking international law. So Britain demands the release of Mason and Slidell, as well as a formal apology and orders. And at the same time, they actually ordered troops to Canada and the Western Atlantic to await retaliation. And I have a quote here. It thus appears that certain individuals have been forcibly taken from on board a British vessel, the ship of a neutral power, while such vessel was pursuing a lawful and innocent voyage. An act of violence, which was an affront to the British flag and a violation of international law. The government of the U.S. must be fully aware that the British government could not allow such an affront to the national honor pass without full reparation. So when Britain sends this message to the U.S. government, now everyone in the North is freaking out because they are like, we are already basically losing this war to the South. We cannot risk an armed conflict with England from the north and directly on Washington and all along the coast where they have their blockade, and have England formally side with the Confederacy. Meanwhile, the South is sitting there praying that Britain's going to declare war on England over this whole thing so that they can come in on their side, be recognized as a sovereign nation, and have a massive superpower come in and help them destroy the North. So it's a very, very high tension for a couple of weeks in the North. And basically, Charles Francis Adams, who is the U.S. minister to Great Britain, assures the British government that the U.S. doesn't want war and that they're going to cave into all their demands, and then advises Seward, the Secretary of State, and Lincoln to do so. And on December 26, 1861, Seward gives a letter to Lord Lyons, who's the British minister to the U.S., summarizing the Lincoln administration's position on the whole ordeal. And where it wasn't a formal apology, they did basically condemn Wilkes's actions in that he didn't take the ship to a formal court for agitation. And they did immediately release Slidell and Mason and their families and their secretaries. And war was avoided with Britain. But for a couple of weeks there, it was really, really looking like there was a possibility of Britain joining the war in an armed conflict against the North. So at the end of January in 1962, Mason and Slidell finally arrive. And however, they do not receive a warm welcome. When they get there, the London papers had actually been writing about how irritated they were at the two for their role in the crisis, because people in London definitely didn't want war with the U.S. And the avoidance of war actually, but the avoidance of war and the assurance of peace between the U.S. and Britain actually bolstered Britain's neutrality stance and made everybody. It really showed the world that Britain was willing to defend its stance on neutrality in this war. And really, at that point, that's kind of where you lose any real hope of Britain coming in on this war. They send military observers to the South, and they're still sending them supplies and getting through the blockade, but they don't actually ever come in on the side of the South and support them in an armed conflict. And it's at that point right there where you really lose any hope of that. So Southerners had hoped that Britain would declare war on the U.S. and recognize the sovereignty of the Confederacy. However, the Trent affair resulted in the opposite and greatly damaged any hope of foreign intervention through Britain. Though Britain would send military advisors to the South, the Trent affair solidified right off the bat the fact that foreign intervention on the side of the South would never be the case.
So I'm going to ask you a quick question. So in your assessment, it almost worked to the detriment of the Confederate government that this happened rather than a positive.
Yes. Yeah, I'd say that at the beginning of it, at that little 2-week tension period where they were really wondering if war was going to happen, that was some high hopes for the Confederacy, and they were really hoping that it would go through. But when it was avoided, and you see that it actually backfires on them when Mason and Slidell get to London, and they're just kind of treated like crap. Nobody really gives them the time of the day. They don't get listened to, and the papers are talking smack about them. So I think it shows.
How long did they end up staying there? Do you know?
I actually couldn't find out when they got back. I was trying to figure that out. I don't know how long they actually ended up staying in London, but I can't imagine it was very long because right off the bat they're not getting a warm reception. They're getting, kind of slid to the side in meetings and things like that. And so I think right off the bat, right there, it just shows that
I
that
seem
Britain
to,
was really never going to come in on the side of the Confederacy.
I seem to recall something back, years ago, reading something to the effect that they were trying to get a audience with Lord Palmerston, maybe, and they couldn't, or there was
Yeah.
difficulty meeting with the
So
Hyde. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. They actually Palmerston was really one of the ones that was advocating for neutrality, and he really didn't want to listen to what either of those dudes had to say. And see, he didn't. I can't find. I didn't find a specific instance of their meeting, but I did find that yeah, they basically were being pushed aside, not being listened to, and the papers were just really showing irritation at their whole role in the crisis. And I think at that moment, that's really a turning point for the Confederacy because it solidified the fact that they would not have foreign recognition as an independent nation and they wouldn't get support from armed forces. And that was two big things that I think really would have helped the Confederacy actually win this war. So that'd be my first point is the detrimental effect that the Trent Affair had on the Confederacy. My next one would be it's kind of similar to Ben's second point, but I'm expanding a little bit farther on it. I said that federal forces under Ulysses S. Grant captured Fort Henry and Donelson and gained control of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, leading to Albert Sidney Johnston being killed at Shiloh. So, Fort Henry and Donelson, in early 61, Tennessee is raising troops and they realize that they need to defend their borders and the best access from the north into Tennessee is through the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. And so they put up lots of defenses around the rivers, water guns, all the whole, and then these two forts. However, when they were planning the building of the forts, they wanted to remain on Tennessee side in order to respect Kentucky neutrality, which I don't really understand because they still had, Johnston's headquarters, Albert Sidney Johnston's headquarters at this point are in Bowling Green. He's leading what's known as at the time as the Army of Central Kentucky. Johnston is charged at the time with defending the whole Confederate territories west of the Allegheny Mountains and has 40,000 men stretched from Kentucky to Tennessee and Arkansas and all the way to Missouri. So his line is already pretty thin. And there is not a whole lot of troops in Fort Henry at this time. And Fort Henry is actually located on the lower banks of the river. And all around it are high ridge mountains. And it's just in a terrible position. They realize right off the bat, but they've already built it by the time Johnston gets there. And they decide to just, bolster their defenses there as much as possible. They built Fort Hyman on the ridges to the southwest to try to defend it from enfiladaing fire on the other hills. Unfortunately, by the time winter comes around, the floodwaters of the Tennessee River are rising rapidly and Fort Hyman has to be abandoned. So, where was I here? Sorry, 1 second. So once the winter waters really start coming in, Tillman, who had been put in charge by Johnston to make preparations for everything in the forts, orders the abandonment of Fort Hyman and prepares for the evacuation of Fort Henry. At the time, on February 2nd, Grant gets permission to start coming down with his, what's known at the time as the Army, the District of Cairo. And he takes 2 divisions by steamboat south to a spot known as Camp Halleck, about 4 miles north of Fort Henry. The plan was for his ironclads under command of Andrew Foote to start pounding away at Fort Henry while Grant's 2 divisions would block the retreating Confederates from escaping to Fort Donelson. On February 6, 1862, at 11 in the morning, Grant begins pounding away from his ironclads on the Tennessee River, while Tillman and his 90 volunteers who stayed to tried to defend the forts as best as possible while the rest of the army made its escape, start pounding away, and seriously damaged two of Grant's ironclads under the command of Andrew Foote. So here's Foote's after-action report of how badly damaged the ironclads were. The Essex being one of the ironclads, the Essex unfortunately received a shot in her boilers, which resulted in the wounding by scalding of 29 men, including Commander Porter. The Essex then necessarily dropped out of line astern, entirely disabled and unable to continue the fight. Another ironclad, the Cincinnati, then took 32 hits, the St. Louis 7, the Carondelet 6. So all these ironclads have taken serious damage and now need repair. All four of the fort's heavy guns are lost, and 21 casualties in the fort are the Confederate losses. In the excitement, however, Tillman had planned to stay just long enough to witness the strength of the Federal assault, and then he was going to retreat to Fort Donelson with the rest of his troops. However, in the excitement, he gets caught and surrounded and ends up surrendering with the fort. Now, on a side note, Tillman, I got a little bit of a problem with, because this guy comes in and basically shuts down any proposals for renovations to be made to the forts when he's supposed to be bolstering them. Just a terrible, terrible engineer, honestly, and then a worse fighter. So then he decides, like, all right, this is where they're going to be. Oh, okay, great. We're just going to abandon them right away, and then gets himself captured right there at the very first fight. And it's just like, I don't know. I think that guy's kind of a fool. There's some other things, but I'm gonna keep going here. So Grant's infantry had actually been super slowed down by the rising floodwaters and muddy roads, and were not able to block the Confederate retreat to Donelson. So now there's 2,500 men at Donelson. However, they left all of their equipment, every bit of ammo crate, food, everything was left at Fort Henry. All their tents, most of their overcoats, most of their knapsacks. Literally, most of these men only had their muskets, which most of them were flintlocks as well. Flintlocks and their cartridge boxes, and no commander. So it is now a desperate situation, and fearing the loss of Fort Donelson, Albert Sidney Johnston is afraid he's going to be cut off from Bowling Green, Kentucky, and orders the evacuation of Bowling Green and the reinforcement of Donelson. So Johnston then stacks reinforcements in Donelson with troops from Simon Bolivar Buckner's division, John Buchanan Floyd's brigades, and then he later gets troops from Brigadier Gideon Johnson Pillow, who Johnston then orders to take command of Donelson and improve the defenses there. They dig a bunch of earthworks, improve makeshift abattis, and then also improve gun emplacements. They're also reinforced inside the fort by the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, Forrest's Cavalry. And by February 12th, there's over 20,000 troops inside of Donelson. So almost a full corps in comparison to an Eastern army, is sitting inside of Fort Donelson at this point. So then on February 13th, Grant's getting a little bit impatient and decides to assault Donelson without waiting for his gunboats to be repaired, which ended up being kind of a bad decision, because his ironclad would be damaged severely in that fight. And then also Morrison's brigade, one of Grant's infantry brigades, suffers heavy losses in 3 separate frontal assaults on the fort that were unsuccessful. And then early in the morning on the 14th, CS Brigadiers Floyd, Pillow, and Buckner decide to attempt a breakthrough to get to Nashville. And they were supposed to assault the next day, but all 3 of them have a different idea on the plan. All of Buckner's men go into the fight, all wearing their knapsacks and ready to take the position and keep marching to Nashville, where Pillow's men leave all their knapsacks behind, thinking they're going to be able to rout the Union right flank and then leisurely go back to their earthworks and collect all of their things. So the plan's really confused. And then by 5-6 o'clock in the next day, the order to attack still hadn't been given, and the Confederates lose their chance to easily escape to Nashville. Then on February 15th, the Confederates launch an assault on the Union right to clear the way to Nashville. They succeed in turning the right flank. However, Grant then returns to the battlefield and is able to organize a counterattack, basically ending their attempts to break out that day. On the night of the 15th, the leaders of the CS brigadiers in charge of Fort Donelson meet again, and Floyd says that he has no intention of surrendering the fort with his forces. And then something kind of crazy happens. Buckner kind of chides in and says, like, oh, well, you're the commanding officer. You should surrender the fort. You should surrender with the fort. You should suffer the same fate. And so, taking that as a challenge, Floyd passes command to Pillow, who then immediately passes it to Buckner, who then calls for a bugler and some paper and issues the surrender. The next morning, Floyd is able to take his brigade out and loads all of them onto two steamboats minus one regiment, who he left at the dock, thinking that they were about to be hit by a Union assault. And then Forrest's cavalry escapes, and everyone else in the fort has to surrender. That's a loss of about 12,000 troops for Johnston right there. So that's a huge loss for him at this point, where he's still not even got a full army built, that's already thinly stretched out. And the loss, I mean, it was just such a huge loss for the Confederates. I mean, the loss of the forts allowed for Union control of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. Most of Tennessee at that point, Nashville at that point was lost. Central Kentucky was lost, and an entire corps worth of men had surrendered at the fort. So 6 weeks later, Grant would use the Tennessee River to his great advantage, landing much needed reinforcements at Shiloh from Don Carlos Buell. And earlier in that day at Shiloh, when the Confederacy nearly had victory in its grasp, Johnston would be severely wounded behind the knee by friendly fire and would bleed out within an hour. Huge loss for the Confederacy there in the loss of Albert Sidney Johnston, as Ben was saying earlier, one of the most promising commanders of the South, other than Robert E. Lee. However, the loss of Fort Donelson and Henry, I think it really represents a turning point in the terms of raising Union morale. These are the first two big victories, really, for the Union in either theater of the war. And then it creates irreplaceable losses in manpower, supplies, and terrain for the Confederacy. Like I said, they lost Central Kentucky, most of Tennessee at that point. And then it really set the Western armies into this revolving cycle of retreating further and further into the deep South. I think that's kind of what Ben was also talking about. So similar points there is that after this is really where, is right off the bat, the Western armies of the Confederacy lose their initiative and kind of set this trend of falling back to an important supply position, an important, strategical spot, and they would try to their best to defend it and then end up having to fall back, being overwhelmed or flanked. And it's just this constant cycle all the way really till the end of the war. I mean, from Fort Henry to Donelson is the point where that starts to set that trend. Then you have Shiloh, Corinth, all the way to Vicksburg. Then you have Chattanooga, Chickamauga, all the way down to, Savannah. So that is what leads me into my next point, really, which, believe it or not, same as Ben, the appointment of Grant to General-in-Chief or Lieutenant General in March of 1864. So I think that's just a very true turning point right there. And it happens. This is really, I feel like, what seals the deal for the Confederacy. So Grant takes command of all Union forces in 1864. And I feel like the strategical and tactical importance of the Western theater really played no small part in the overall defeat of the Confederacy. After the loss of Hyman, Henry, Donelson, Nashville, Memphis, control of the Tennessee, Cumberland, and Mississippi rivers, 2/3 of Tennessee, Shiloh, Corinth, Vicksburg, more than half of all Confederate territory at this point was now in federal control. So that is just so much ground that has been lost just back to back to back to back. So Grant, is in command of all of these victories. Not only is he robbing the South of all supplies, land, and manpower necessary for war, he was helping support of the war stay alive in the Army. Now, I think this is kind of an overlooked part. Like we really look at like the people back home for voting for Lincoln in reelection, but you have to remember that the armies have votes too. These are massive, massive groups of men that are really important for the vote right here. And I think that showing them a string of victories for years and years and years really helps build this belief in Grant. As soon as he's promoted to command of all armies, I think that's a huge morale booster that men really were like, okay, we have a chance to do this at this point. So where else was I? So not only, yeah, so not only just the morale and the votes for that, but they're just consistently giving up land. Grant relieves Rosecrans after his defeat at Chickamauga and heads to Chattanooga personally with 20,000 troops after Vicksburg and all that. Chattanooga is the last Confederate stronghold, real stronghold in Tennessee. I know they go up to Nashville later, but this is really where they get kicked out of Tennessee for good. Now in charge of the military division of the Mississippi, armies of the Cumberland, Tennessee, Ohio, and Potomac. Grant now has command of all Western armies, organizes the armies in a grand assault on Lookout Mountain, Missionary Ridge, forces Johnston's army out of Tennessee. And then in March of 64 is when he gets the official promotion to general in chief and given command of all the Union armies, east and west. The only people who had held the rank of lieutenant general before that, George Washington, and then breveted to Winfield Scott during the Mexican War, not Winfield Scott Hancock. And I think that promotion is just the last true turning point. There is true cohesion between all Union forces for the first time in the war. Lincoln is more hands-off with this commander than he has been previous commanders. And I think that is a debatable point in itself, because I'm not sure if I have this theory that it's not that Lincoln had so much confidence in Grant to do the job. I think he might have just been so convinced he was not going to win the election that he just didn't even care anymore. He just realized that, you know what, this is going to be it for me. They're probably going to vote to end the war anyways, and I'm just going to let this guy do his thing. And that's really what you see him do. He gives full command to Grant, and then him and Sherman come up with what they're going to do. So Grant places Sherman, who's a good friend, in charge of the military division of the Mississippi, and Grant sets up his headquarters in the east. I just love this quote from Sherman. I haven't read Sherman's memoirs, but I just remember it from Ken Burns. But Sherman goes on to say, he stood by me when I was crazy, and I stood by him when he was drunk. And that really sums up these two kind of relationships that these guys have. And they're just like, they're just such wild men. Like, these guys are really, they're just crazy to me. They go out and just really start this, they take total war seriously. And so that's their plan. Their plan is to just completely destroy the other one's army. So Grant's going after Lee directly, and Sherman is going after Johnston. And their plan is to just destroy them and continue to split the Confederacy in half. They were going to attack the Confederacy from all different directions. So the Army of the Potomac and Meade are attacking Lee. Butler is attacking south of Richmond from the James River. Sherman's attacking Johnston and Sherman's attacking Johnson in Georgia, and then George Crook and William Averill are destroying railroads in West Virginia. Nathaniel P. Banks is supposed to capture Mobile. And so for the first time, you have this real coordinated effort of all armies under the command of one guy that's going after all these different parts of the Confederacy, and really just putting that chokehold on its finishing touches right there. So Grant's supervising all of this while he's in the field with the Meade and the Army of the Potomac. And then you get the Overland Campaign, the Atlanta Campaign, Petersburg, and eventually Sherman will have completely cut off the Deep South, and Lee has nowhere to go and ends up surrendering in Appomattox. So for the first time, this is where the Army of the Potomac is steadily moving forward and not retreating. Even after defeat at Cold Harbor, they're still moving towards Lee, still trying to press on Lee. He's the first Union commander really not scared of Lee, I feel like. Like, you have all these other commanders that come in and then are just fight Lee one time and get so shell-shocked. They're like, oh my God, I thought we were just going to crush him. And then that's not the case, and they don't know what to do. Grant's the first one who's able to really stay cool after a big fight with Lee that doesn't go his way and keep moving forward. He's quoted as saying, stop worrying about what Bobby Lee will do to us and start concerning yourselves with what we're going to do to him. And that's the first time I feel like that attitude was been taken by any Union Army in the whole war. And so by Petersburg, Grant has really instilled much more faith in the war. Lincoln was able to secure the re-election with the majority of his votes coming from the Army. And if you look at it, I mean, most of I know Ben was talking about how the Overland campaign was a little bit was really important for votes because the action is all close to Washington and governmental leaders are seeing it firsthand. I would argue that votes are more important coming from the Western theater just based purely on numbers. I mean, it is a much grander scale of not only just the army, but a much wider territory of Union supporters and people who have been liberated by Union armies, like Unionists in Tennessee, are all going to continue to support the war. All of Grant's armies and all of his troops are all going to support the war. And then in the East, you have a faction of the troops that are still supporting Meade, but majority of them want to continue with this war. So I really feel like Grant carrying the West is what brought all these votes for Lincoln in 64. And then when he took command of all armies, it really unified that. So Grant won victory after victory from the moment his army headed from Camp Halleck and slowly strangled the Confederacy to death. Victories in the West cut the South in half and earned him respect from the White House. Once D.C. placed their faith in Grant and promoted him to lieutenant general, any hope of Southern independence would be completely dead just over a year later. So I think as soon as you see that appointment, that's really the last stroke of hope for the Confederacy right there.
Well, that was a nice micro history of the whole war there, Dylan. Thank you.
I try.
Right. So to summarize your three, you've got the Trent Affair, the capture of Forts Henry and Donelson, and the appointment of U.S. Grant.
Yes, correct.
You have some carryover between Mr. Flowerday. Kind of two of them, actually, if you kind of link the Henry Donelson, Shiloh, Johnston issue. And
Grant. Exactly. Yeah. I think that's just a hard part of it to ignore. I really couldn't decide between those two, but I decided to just go a little bit deeper and think like what eventually caused Shiloh to happen is Union control of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers.
Sure. That's what I found a little when I was trying to decide. You can butterfly effect anything back to like one specific point, like
exactly. It's
like someone being on a street corner in 1861 really has an effect. I don't know. It was had to figure out where to actually draw the line to this event caused this.
Totally, yeah. And you can keep just, dillying back all as far as you really want to. It's really, this was just about kind of picking out three that stood out to us, I think, and trying to be creative, think outside the box. And I really like where we've ended up so far. I'm excited to see what Master Quina has to say.
All right. Well, Master Quina is on the same wavelength with you folks on Henry and Donelson. That was my number 3. I'm going to go 3, 2, 1, which honestly they actually do follow chronologically as well. So I had Forts Henry and Donelson as my 3rd.
So you're most important.
Yep, for the same reasons that I'm not going to reiterate from what you guys have eloquently said. I think that line that Johnston was holding in Tennessee and Kentucky in 62 was tenuous. It was this position-oriented defense. Yeah. He had troops here, he had troops here, he had troops here, but they never really consolidated their men in one spot. And so when Mill Springs falls in January of 62, and then in February, shortly thereafter, you've got Henry and Donelson going, it's over.
Yeah.
And this web of the Confederates, it begins to contract into Tennessee. You lose Nashville, Memphis, New Orleans falls. And like you said, you set up that whole cataclysmic battle at Shiloh, and then Corinth falls, which is a major railroad hub in North Mississippi. So I've got Henry and Donelson.
I almost had New Orleans as mine. That was on the
New Orleans is really when the Mississippi was blocked.
Right.
I don't buy this.
It wasn't Vicksburg. I think New Orleans was more important than Vicksburg, and it proved that. Sorry to get on a tangent here, but it proved that the North had the capability to occupy a deep South city effectively for a long term. Anyway,
No, I
Sorry.
agree. I think no. So it opens up that whole thing, and it elevates Grant to a position of a war hero in the North. Which, like you said, if those two camp, if he gets a black eye at Fort Donelson or Henry, or God forbid gets shot or wounded there and dies,
Yeah.
you don't have him anymore. So I think it really elevates him in the war in the Northern mystique. He becomes a war hero. Although he's going to have a fall from grace after Shiloh because Halleck is going to basically rein him in and put him on a desk job because he's jealous of him. So
Yeah.
Grant has this kind of up and down issue there until he takes Vicksburg. But I do think
He
I
was so great during Vicksburg too. I mean, that's not really where he gained popularity necessarily. Yeah,
right,
after he succeeded, but leading up to it, they were not happy
right.
with his drink ass.
So I've got Henry and Donaldson as my third, for all those reasons. 12,000 Confederates captured, But lastly, one thing that I will add is it was the first time that you have naval and ground forces working together in a joint military effort. And that's a huge thing in the Civil War when you've got the Navy and the land forces working together. Grant and Admiral Foote, I think that was a real turning point in how cooperation was being marshaled in the war effort.
Yeah, I think
Um,
I agree with that big time. That really showed them that they could do it at, Shiloh and later on in Vicksburg. Like
Vicksburg, yep,
that's really where they learned that, yeah, okay, this works. We can hit them on land and water at the
yep,
same time. Even though it didn't look
absolutely,
so great at Henry, yeah, Grant's two infantry divisions getting slowed down by the floodwaters and the muddy roads, but
yeah,
the idea showed that, yeah, this cohesion is really going to have a good effect. That's a really good point.
yep. My second one is a couple months later, June, and I'm entitling it June of 1862. It's the month of June, 1862. You've got a lot of things going on here in the East, in the Richmond environs. Basically, you've got the wounding of Joseph Johnston, who is going to be wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines on May 31st, 1862. As we'll recall, Johnston's army is kind of in this defensive position outside of Richmond, within a few miles of the gates of Richmond. George McClellan's massive Army of the Potomac is taking a position from up near the Chickahominy down to the James, and Johnston tries to assault him. He's at Seven Pines. He's wounded by a shell fragment, and for about 12 hours, this no-name general named Gustavus Smith commands the army. He has kind of a nervous breakdown, but at the end of the day, um, President Davis is going to put Robert E. Lee in command of the army. And Lee, and I brought it out here to read. Other people had referred to the Army of Northern Virginia as the Army of Northern Virginia before Special Orders 22 was put out. But on June 1st, 1862, was the very first time that it was officially called that in an official capacity. And
Oh,
it's
that's
Special Orders number 22. It's in the ORs, volume 11, part 3, issued on June 1st. It's Lee's first orders to the Army, and it says that he's going to be basically assuming command of the armies of Eastern Virginia and North Carolina. And he refers to it for the first time as the Army of Northern Virginia. And so I
that's cool.
think that is a huge turning point. And then later that month, you have him, viciously attacking George McClellan's army in the 7 Days campaign in that last week of June. He slowly, methodically drives McClellan back to his base of operations on the James River. His battles are very costly, but he has to basically intimidate McClellan to a point where he's got to save Richmond. And the reason I think June of 62 is a turning point is because everything up to June, as we just pointed out, had really fallen in the Union's favor. Union looks like they're going to win this war by the spring of 62. Nashville's fallen, Henry and Donelson, Shiloh, Corinth, all these Western garrisons have fallen. And the only thing that's really left on the chessboard is Richmond. Okay. And so McClellan he's this close. And so when Lee drives him back and McClellan doesn't believe that he can resume the offensive, he retreats all the way back to the tip of the York James Peninsula and kind of huddles up there for the rest of the summer. Um, and so it's at this point that Lincoln really kind of starts to think about how this war is going to go long term, because obviously, even though we've done very well up to this point, we haven't taken the Confederate capital. The Army of Northern Virginia is still around. And so that's when Lincoln starts to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. He issues that not as a result of Antietam, he issues it as a result of the 7 days, McClellan's loss on the peninsula. And so he floats the draft out there, but he has to wait until he has a victory to issue it. It'd be funny to see, it'd be interesting to know what would have happened had McClellan taken Richmond in 62. The war probably would have ended. The Confederates would have probably maybe come back into the Union with slavery intact. Who knows? Because it hadn't got to that point where slavery was that big of an issue in the collective conscience of the politicians.
No,
And so,
exactly. It came about that a little bit later on, but at this point, that I think that you're correct, is that it's a very good possibility that, like, had Joe Johnston not been wounded, and I think, like we were talking about in the last episode with his wake up and retreat idea, his whole mentality, he would have ended up, stuck in Richmond, surrounded. McClellan would have had put up his big guns, rode around the army, and as you said, look at how great of a general I am, and taken Richmond, and the whole war would have ended. I think
yep,
with a very good possibility that the South could have kept slavery intact, because at that point Lincoln was still really concerned about keeping the country together, and wanted to bring people back with this, good feeling still that we're all Americans and we can all get what we want. And
yeah, yep.
I I really agree with that.
The war had not gotten to a bitter depths that had gotten a year or two later. It still was on that precipice of being, we're going to restore the Union back to the way that it was, not the
Yeah,
way that it should be. And so I think Lee's ascendancy to command, those bloody battles around Richmond, and then everything that follows that following several months in Virginia with a string of victories, I think, you take off from there, and that's that. So that's
yeah.
my second one, is June of 1862. I think that's a huge turning point in the war. And then my final one is playing off what we had talked about last episode, is taking Atlanta, which leads to Lincoln's reelection in 64. I think that's the last. I
Oh,
think if
the capture of Atlanta.
capture of Atlanta, which leads to Lincoln's reelection, I think that's I tend to take a little issue with the comments earlier that the Overland campaign was this glorified, you know, um, positive bit of news for the North. I don't think it was. I think the North, and maybe I misheard what you all said, but I think the North looked at Grant's campaign as a failure by August of 64. He'd lost 55,000 men. People were calling him a butcher. He had Lee surrounded, but Lee had him immobilized as well. And so I'm looking at it from a northern perspective here. And so the only real good news that comes out of the summer and late summer of 64 is Atlanta. And it's a tangible piece of evidence that we have captured a Confederate garrison with minimal loss. And it's a positive thing for the Union Army. It also destroys a great deal of the Confederate war industry. Atlanta and the surrounding areas were huge with their depots and their industry and their factories. With Grant stalled out at Petersburg with 55,000 casualties that year, and early on the loose in the Shenandoah, which he was doing very well, marching all the way up to Washington almost. I think that moment in September, taking Atlanta, was the first bit of good news that the North had all year, really. Yes, Grant had made progress. Yes, he had Lee bottled up at Petersburg, but the North was very weary in the summer of 64. And I think Lincoln, he wrote the blind memorandum to his cabinet saying, if I don't get reelected, we've got to try to finish this war until before the inauguration. Lincoln was thinking he wasn't going to get reelected. And if he doesn't get reelected, I think the Confederates then have a really good chance to negotiate a peace based on separation of the states. And so I think Atlanta is probably, to me, that key moment that begins a glimmer of hope in the Union army, in the Union populace's eyes, that hey, we can do this. It's been a terrible year so far, but we've got a chance now because our armies are on the loose in Georgia and theirs are in retreat. It really is the first tangible victory of the year, besides maybe Mobile in August. But
so that's kind of what I was saying earlier, was that whereas I think Grant's appointment was an actual turning point of the war that led to, like, from his success in the West, those successes followed Sherman, right? Because Sherman ends up head of this military division of Mississippi. And so I think Sherman ends up leading this massive group of men, over 110,000 strong, that all have very big support for the war. And so, like you were saying, I think it touches a little bit of the same thing, is that there's a lot of support for the war down in the Western, like, theater and Atlanta campaign, going into actually Atlanta and then Savannah. And then whereas in the Eastern theater, it's just this bloodbath that I think up there is probably making the North very weary of the war, and people that are seeing it, like civilians and all that are just reading about it in the papers, definitely less likely to support it than the Unionists in Tennessee, who have been freed by Grant's armies.
This is exactly why last episode I was kind of taking issue with your whole, you were kind of defending Johnston's strategy. I think had Johnston inflicted the same amount of casualties upon Sherman, I think we got a different ball game. And you asked the question, and I should have answered a different way last episode. You said, well, how long would he have had to do this? And I should have said to the election. And that would have been it. So I think by 64, you've got one chance to win this thing. It's an election. You got to elect McClellan. The Democratic platform that year was calls for negotiations with the Confederacy on the subject of a potential truce. That was their platform. So if the Democrats get elected in 64 with McClellan at the top of their ticket, it could, all of the loss, all of the casualties, all of the bloodshed would have been for naught. So those are my three. Henry and Donaldson, June 1862, and Atlanta and the Lincoln reelection in 64. Excellent, gentlemen. I mean, I think they were all great. We have some carryover, all three of us, obviously. I think we're all in agreement that the Henry and Donaldson was a huge issue at the beginning of the war.
And then the manpower loss, I guess, surrendered there, but the rivers themselves, I mean, that's full control of two major rivers that are coming in right through the middle of the South, not just Tennessee, but all the way to the ocean.
Yep.
And I think too, with that, it kind of sets this tone of just massive disorganization in the West for the Confederates. I mean, they really had a tough time figuring out how to prioritize where to send their manpower. Did you send it to the cities along the Mississippi? Did you defend the interior in Atlanta? Did you try to do both or neither? Did you invade Kentucky? I mean, there was this general lack of vision, this lack of prioritization. And in the East, I think it was a little bit more straightforward. Keep McClellan or whoever's in charge of the Army of the Potomac out of Richmond. As long as you're doing that, you're okay. But in the West, it was just all of this. You had limited manpower to cover industry, railroad hubs, and port cities along the Gulf and the Mississippi, and they just never really were quite able to concentrate and organize to do all of that.
That was one of the problems with Davis's strategy from the beginning out West, is he thought he could hold all these different areas, and he just couldn't. And it was a problem. They should have marshaled their forces in a couple of big armies and done what they could, knowing and just accepting the fact that they're going to lose a lot of territory, but that the Union's going to have to occupy that territory too. So
I think we touched on a good point earlier, talking about too how after Donaldson and Henry, it really sets this trend of falling back, trying to get to a new important railway junction or port city or supply hub, defending it best they could, and then being overwhelmed or flanked and falling back again. And so you see this trend start with our city, Johnston, really. See it start with him going all the way back to Shiloh, and then he gets killed at Shiloh, and then you see the trend with Beauregard for a little bit, and then Pemberton, and then you see it with Bragg, and then you see it all the way again back from to Joe Johnston, who was doing it in the very beginning in Richmond, and it's just this constant cycle that gets put in motion of just retreat, try to defend, fall back again. And
Confederates found one man in the war that could command an army, and it
Yeah.
was Robert E. Lee. It's
Exactly.
as simple as that. And they needed a half a dozen of them.
Yeah, I think like you were talking last time about making, and then we talked about it a little bit just earlier, but making Sherman or Grant pay for every step that they take. Like Lee was making Grant pay for every little bit of ground he was taking. Johnston is really trying to conserve his manpower and fall back. But I think that it was really from the beginning, it's kind of out of Johnston's control. It's already on this cycle. If they've already lost the initiative going way back to Donaldson of trying to be able to make them pay. And they like even if Johnston decides to just change who he is as a person and completely go after Sherman right off the bat, I think there's a very good chance that they get overwhelmed right off the beginning and lose Georgia very early on. But like you were saying, we don't know because we don't know what Sherman was made out of at that time. We know what happened with the strategy they took, but had Johnston's defensive tactics or even offensive tactics been different right off the bat, it's hard to really say because they had already been put in motion in this cycle of retreating and falling back, and they've already lost so much. He's already so depleted by the time Johnston takes command, and he spends time trying to rebuild it when in reality he could have been trying to make Sherman pay. We don't know. Just this really bad cycle that they get put into right off the bat.
So one thing I think is really overlooked too, and I almost included this in some capacity, but is the battles for Chattanooga in November of 1863. I mean, this is the best position that the Army of Tennessee finds itself in for a while. I mean, they win at Chickamauga, they march north, they have Grant's army surrounded. I don't know if you've been to Lookout Mountain or Missionary Ridge, but the fact that Grant was able to escape from that precarious of a position, and to some extent the fact that Bragg somehow lost Lookout Mountain is a pretty big knock on him. But that right there would have probably been the best chance for the Army of Tennessee to inflict a victory, a meaningful victory later in the war, building upon the success of Chickamauga, driving them back, stalling out the Western Federal Army. And I think Grant's management of that is part of what led him to become Lincoln's pick for lieutenant general. If by breaking out of the siege there and then knocking Bragg back to Dalton, that was a pretty massive undertaking, and it went really well for Grant.
I think you have to give really you can't give all the credit for Chattanooga to Grant. You have to look at George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland. He had only been ordered by Grant to just take the rifle pits, but Thomas actually carries the assault all the way through Missionary Ridge and takes the whole position. And while he was disobeying orders, it ended up working out for Grant. So I think you have to really give some credit to George Thomas right there, acting on his own and being willing to carry a position he thought valuable.
Yeah, but the larger issue, I think, is that Grant brought steadiness, he brought stability, he brought a sense of calm wherever he went.
Yeah,
a lot like Lee. I mean, I think he inherits this mess at Chattanooga. The Confederates are on the high ground. They've almost got them cut off from their supplies, which rarely ever happened if you were a Confederate army to a Union army. And so I think he comes, he kind of takes over. He basically instills in that army, after having been whipped at Chickamauga, a really fine morale boost, and it helps. So I agree. I think Chattanooga is a significant turning point in the war as well.
Was that your honorable mention, Ben?
No, so let's talk about our honorable mentions.
Yeah.
I'll start with mine first, and then we can move. So my honorable mention was actually First Manassas, but it's not for the reasons that Ben said. Mine was it's actually for something that didn't happen.
Hmm.
I think First Manassas was the point, maybe the only point in the war, where if the Confederates had followed up quickly, swiftly, and with everything they had, which I think they could have walked right into Washington by the end of July, and they could have dictated terms. And I think they could have won militarily the Civil War in about 90 days. I think that was the one area where the one point in time where they could have literally forced themselves to win the war.
Because after that, Washington just became this massive fortress. What, the most well defended city on earth or something? I mean,
They went
Washington was undefended. The public was not mentally prepared for a long war at that point. And you can imagine the Confederate armies marching down Pennsylvania Avenue up to the White House and demanding peace. I just think that would have been so the Confederates not doing that, I think, is a huge. That's the last time they probably have the ability to win militarily.
So what happened? Why do you think? Why do you think that wasn't followed up on?
Couple things, and I'll try to distill it in my opinion. Number one, Stonewall Jackson wanted to. He urged Johnston and Beauregard to push forward, but Johnston and Beauregard said, "Our men are too tired. There's a huge rainstorm after the battle." So from a logistical standpoint, they said they were too worn out. I think they were happy that they'd won. I think they thought maybe this will be it. Maybe we'll win. Maybe Britain will come in on our side. Maybe this will be enough to win it. But larger conceptually, the Confederate government under Davis, up until September of 62, did not want to be perceived as the aggressor in this war. They wanted to be the defense. We're just defending our homeland. All we want to do is be left alone. And that was their policy. Davis didn't necessarily want to invade Pennsylvania or Maryland or Kentucky. He did begrudgingly. But I think it was a policy that he just wanted to not be perceived as the aggressor. And so he did not force those generals to do that. And I think that was a huge mistake. So that's my honorable mention.
I think those are some good points right there.
Benny, what do you got?
So my honorable mention is in a similar vein to Dylan's first, was just the lack of foreign intervention on behalf of the Confederacy generally as a whole. I toyed with Atlanta, I toyed with Chattanooga, but I think the Confederacy was really trying to model this war after the American Revolution. There are a couple times that it's kind of implicitly said that. And the American Revolution was built on just being annoying enough for England to decide that it was not worth fighting, and then also having the support of the French army and navy and the French military power. And I think the Confederacy had this idea in the back of their mind that if they proved their cause to England, England was going to come in full-heartedly on the side of the Confederacy, recognize them as a foreign as an entity, and give them military support beyond the ability to buy cheap uniforms and equipment. And so I think the fact that they never came in on the side of the Confederacy was really a black eye to the cause. Really delegitimized the Confederacy's claim to be a sovereign nation. And eventually, with the economic and home front issues that the Confederacy was facing, they were never really able to recover and weren't able to end the war quickly enough without foreign support. So that's my honorable mention. And I put it as an honorable mention because other than kind of the Trent affair, there's no real specific point where it was like, no, this is definitively not the thing. I feel like they were I feel like the Confederates were kind of constantly feeling led on by Britain, and that there was always this chance of intervention, and that if they just won one more battle, or if they just did this, that they would finally convince England to come in on their side. And I think that just slowly fizzled out towards the end of the war.
Yeah, it's
I,
the girl at the bar that you want but you can't have, right?
Right,
yeah,
exactly. She's, and every once in a while, she'll flirt with
Flirt
you a
with
little
it.
bit and then walk away, and then you're chasing her and
Yep.
you're distracted from the main focus of everything by keeping an eye there. But yeah, I think that's an
I,
important factor.
I
All right.
think nice. So yeah, I think that the lack of foreign intervention on the side of the Confederacy is definitely just a major contributing factor to the fact that the reason why they lost. And then I kind of like how you're comparing it. Yeah, they kind of felt led on. I feel like I think the Trent affair is really where you can actually pinpoint the fact that like that's this point right there where you just know that any hope of Britain or France coming in on their side with arms and men just wasn't going to happen. Their stance on neutrality was just too strong, too popular among the people of London. It wasn't gonna happen. Not to mention slavery being a big issue for Britain. Um, but I think that, like you said, they kind of were led on up until, which is my honorable mention. I think you guys all could have predicted it. Is the Battle of Gettysburg?
Oh,
Um, for just so
Uh,
got there.
right? I'm sorry to be basic, but
No, I'm glad you did because I've got
I think I
turning
think we
point.
I've
went.
got some very interesting things to talk about. Go ahead. Go ahead.
There's just so many things that happened in Gettysburg that actually really just solidify, I think, the fact that the South is not going to win this war. One of them being, I think that's a good, another point right there where most of the South kind of realized that Britain wasn't going to come in to help. Not after that defeat. So not only does that, but specifically, you see at Gettysburg the disintegration of Confederate command on nearly every level, both literally in combat and then also metaphorically through just chain of command. But really, throughout the whole battle and campaign, you see just this complete disintegration of the chain of command. Stuart rides around the Army of the Potomac on an unauthorized raid. You have Heath bringing on a general engagement on the first day, and Rhodes sealing the deal by deploying his division. Longstreet lagging on pretty much every aspect from the beginning of the campaign till the end of the battle. Anderson not cooperating, Hood getting wounded, Lee doesn't meet with his corps commanders the night of July 2nd. Benning follows the wrong attack. Anderson doesn't cooperate again on the third day. Longstreet calls off the assault early. Just so many things happen at Gettysburg that if they had happened a little bit differently, could have completely been a change for the entire way the war was fought after that. The fact that Gettysburg was fought at all, I think, was a turning point of the war. Instead of them just marching on to Harrisburg and leaving a corps or even a few divisions just to guard the supply lines, to guard the roads back to Staunton and everything. I think not pressing on to Harrisburg and taking that city and forcing me to come to him is another just a huge turning point in the war. So, like I said, Gettysburg just has so much that happens there that you really can't talk about turning points without at least mentioning it.
No, I see where you're coming from. As someone who finds the battle extremely interesting because there's so much primary source out there, and I love studying the battle for all those what ifs. I don't think at the time it was looked upon as that big of a deal. If you read it's funny because I knew one of you would choose Gettysburg.
You came
So
prepared.
I brought some stuff here, and I know we're
Hold on a
running
second.
out
I
of
gotta
time,
grab my coffee.
but yeah, you might want to get a refill. This could be a 2 drink minimum
Oh yeah,
All
on
right,
these.
one second. I'll be right back.
this is our intermission.
So was it a bad thing for the Confederate Army? Absolutely. I think we can all agree on that. It was a disaster for Lee's army. Okay. But as a turning point at the time, people just looked at it as another bloodbath in a series of bloodbaths that they had had. And I'm going to want to caution us as we move forward. We have to read forward in the evidence, not backwards. We know sitting here today that Lee surrendered at Appomattox. We know that, how it all played out. But the Confederate people didn't just after Gettysburg go, oh, it's over. We're going to count down the days to Appomattox and it's done.
No, not by any means. There was still massive morale was high. I mean, they didn't even think a lot of the army was ready to fight again right after Pickett's charge. I mean, they were not defeated by any means at Gettysburg. I just think
didn't you say there were some that, like, some of the guys probably based on their actions thought that the outcome was at least neutral.
I got it right here. I mean, so if you read forward in the evidence, it doesn't come across as a major setback. Confederates drew a huge distinction between Gettysburg, which had flashes of brilliance on the first and second days, and Vicksburg, which was an absolute defeat with the surrender of an army and the taking of a town. Lee, I think, pronounced it as a logistical victory with all the stuff that he carried out of Pennsylvania. And Lee even says later that year in the fall, he said that even though he lost, he said that, and I'm quoting from Lee here, I think he said this to Harry Heath. He stated that the losses sustained in the campaign did not exceed, quote, what they would have been from the series of battles I would have been compelled to fight had I remained in Virginia. We did whip them at Gettysburg, and it will be seen for the next 6 months that army will be as quiet as a sucking dove. That's Robert E. Lee, okay? There's also a great Confederate diarist, if you want a civilian standpoint from it. Her name was Catherine Devereux Edmiston. She's from North Carolina. She wrote, initially she was extremely down about the battle, but by July 25th in her diary, she wrote an optimistic view about the conflict. She said that Lee was safely back over the river and the Union was in quote unquote pursuit. And she underlined it as if it wasn't really a real thing. Josiah Gorgas, who there's this quote from Josiah Gorgas, and it's a famous one. It's quoted all the time when people talk about Gettysburg being this awful turning point. He said shortly after the battle that yesterday we rode on the pinnacle of success. Today, absolute ruin seems to be our portion. The Confederacy totters to its destruction. Okay, that's right after Lee retreated. But a few weeks later, on July 28th, he writes in his diary into August and later into September, he says, all seems quiet on Lee's front. His army seems to be in its original good position. And he even mentions that they may be assuming the offensive again and moving into Maryland and Pennsylvania. And here's a couple more quotes and then I'll be done. But I'm going to take a couple of quotes from the 12th South Carolina Regiment that I have researched. DJ Carter from Company I, he wrote, the Army is an excellent trim, and we believe we are ready and willing to go wherever General Lee directs, even into the enemy's territory. The prospect of fighting was less likely, according to others, though. I do not think we will have any fight here soon, wrote Joseph Templeton of Company B on August 18th. One officer recalled each successive day was the exact reflection of its antecedent. And then another officer in Company H, he wrote, it is perfect folly to say that the army was whipped, and as some will have it, completely demoralized at the Battle of Gettysburg, for it was not so. And those that thought so were not in the army. He ended on a positive note. He said that Richmond will never can be taken while the Army of Northern Virginia is kept together. And lastly, I'm going to quote, I think probably the one person that we can all agree would have the best perspective on it, Abraham Lincoln. He's so depressed after Gettysburg because Meade didn't follow up against Lee's army. He's absolutely despondent. He wrote this letter and he never sent it to Meade. And he's talking about how he should have pursued. He had him backed up against the river. He had Couch and he had Smith, Baldy Smith there ready to pounce. And he goes, and I quote, again, my dear general, I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. He was within your easy grasp, and to have closed upon him would, in connection with our other late successes, have ended the war. As it is, the war will be prolonged indefinitely. It would, and I am immensely distressed over it. Your golden opportunity is gone, and I am distressed immeasurably because of it. I mean, so I don't know.
This is describing like what, Falling Waters and Williamsport.
Well, the fact that obviously Lincoln didn't think Gettysburg in and of itself was a turning point, because he's saying the war is going to go on indefinitely now because Meade didn't follow up. So I think, I don't know,
a turning point in that sense, because the fact that, yeah, and now that the war is indefinite, when he had an opportunity in front of him to destroy Lee's army in pursuit, I think that in itself is a turning point, because then it's, yes, now the war is going to drag on indefinitely, and we don't know when it's going to end. We had the end in sight, and now we don't. I think that's a turning point.
I'm not so sure that people at the time, either North or South, considered it a big thing. I think looking back now, we know it's the biggest battle. We know that the Gettysburg Address was said. We know that, the National Cemetery was there, and we know all these things about it. But, at the time, I think, and I will say this about Gettysburg, even though it was a loss, like I said last episode, I think it prolonged the war at least a year.
I think too, an important one thing about Gettysburg that kind of prevents it from being seen this way is that the town wasn't before, or didn't become afterwards, any sort of major objective for either army for occupation.
No, and it never was. It was just a spot on the map that happened to be where the armies were.
Right. And if you're not going for an objective from a northern perspective, if you're not taking an objective such as a city or a port or a railroad hub or whatever, the objective is to destroy the other army. And I think that objective was not obtained by Meade. He drove Lee out, but he didn't do enough to destroy him to really consider that a victory. I mean, realistically, the results of the Maryland campaign and the Pennsylvania campaign were eerily, I mean, I would consider it the same thing. Like,
so here's what I would argue is that I think that the biggest loss for the Confederacy at Gettysburg wasn't the land. It's not morale, because like Quina was saying, I don't think that, like, there's just no evidence really suggesting that at the time the army was defeated morally. They were still in high spirits for most of the accounts that I've looked at as well. I think what Meade really succeeded in doing in hurting Lee's army was how much damage he did to his chain of command.
Yeah,
look at
absolutely. Yep.
Almost all of his staff officers are dead or wounded. If you look at the rest of the Army of Northern Virginia, you just have such major losses in everything from, division commanders through all the way down to the company level. And they never recovered from that loss of command. And I think that really is what is now is why Gettysburg is looked at as a turning point, because you just lose so many people who had such good potential. Barksdale, Pender, just to name a couple. And after that point, that's really where you see just a steady decline in achievements of the Army of Northern Virginia.
Yep, I would agree with that. The irreplaceable, I mean, Hood, though he comes back, he doesn't come back to the Army of Northern Virginia. You lose Pender as division, so you've got guys being promoted well beyond their capacity, and once you start losing really division commanders, yeah, and even in some situations where brigadier generals that could have commanded divisions like Barksdale just gone. I mean, things like that. That's where I think the crisis of command really starts to rear its head for the Confederacy.
Exactly.
At least in the Eastern theater.
You're not only losing these higher up commanders, but you're losing good lower level commanders that could have replaced them. So now you don't even have as strong of a pool to draw from. Yeah. And I think that's where you get a big problem for the Confederacy right there.
I agree. And that process of losing the officers started at Chancellorsville. He lost a hell of a lot of officers at Chancellorsville.
Yeah.
Stonewall Jackson chiefly among them. And so much that he had to reorganize the army.
Right.
Right.
The
And
reorganization, I'd say, did work out for the Army. Just the fact that it was reorganized in general, not necessarily with who was put in place where, but
right.
just the Army did need a little reorganization.
No, it
I
did.
think three corps. It probably should have been organized in three corps from the beginning. Basically, I think two was a bit much, but then also losing officers is going to plague Lee for the rest of the war. I mean, look at again. Sorry, but Overland Campaign. You start off with three corps commanders and you end with zero. I mean, you've got Hill, who's so sick he can't really perform. He's staying back in an ambulance. You've got Ewell, who's just turned into a nervous wreck, and then Longstreet, obviously having almost died. It's Lee's biggest problem is going to turn into, from Gettysburg forward, is going to turn into his subordinates, and he's going to have to figure out how to manage that with limited options. But you do have some heroes that pop up. I mean, some guys that maybe didn't have some of that fame or notoriety before the G word, like Gordon or Mahone, who in the next year would prove themselves to be capable at the positions that they held. But I think probably the biggest loss for Lee on Gettysburg was the chain of command that he no longer had access to.
Right, which is why it was my honorable mention as a turning point. Just the pure breakdown in the chain of command, both literally from wounds, but also just from egos, miscommunications, and bad timing. It just plagues the entire battle. Like for example, when they finally do form a plan for the second day, Lee wants to hit the Union left with two whole divisions and ends up hitting it with two regiments. And I don't see how that can be looked at as just not this total disintegration in the chain of command.
All right, I think we're getting too into the weeds about Gettysburg here. We need to do eventually. What should we do? Like our 10th episode, maybe do Gettysburg and just like.
Sure, we're gonna have a couple episodes on Gettysburg.
Have a few drinks, and just do a marathon episode on Gettysburg. We'll have to do day 1, day 2, day 3. I don't think we can do it any other way.
We have to do it as like a series where we just record like.
I'd like to do a series on why Lee went north.
Yeah.
Ooh, interesting.
There's a lot of good stuff in the ORs about that, and but anyway, we can talk about that later. But so I guess well, I think the one thing that we can all agree on is Grant, right?
Yeah, 100%.
And he is the kind of the central focus of winning the war for the North and the Western opening up of the Mississippi Valley.
Yep, and those are both. That's just really you just see this noose that Grant begins putting on the South from the moment he leaves the District of Cairo, gets to Camp Halleck, takes Forts Henry and Donelson, and then it just gets tighter and tighter and tighter until he's put in command of the entire Union armies, and then just dukes it out with Lee for about a year until he defeats him, and then that was really it.
Yeah,
Sherman crushes them from the inside, and that was it.
So program notes, our next episode will be a reenacting topic.
Oh, really?
Yes. So
do you have the topic in mind, or are we gonna spitball a little bit?
We'll do a little meeting about that, but it will be a Civil War reenacting topic. So all the reenactors out there should tune in, and we want to thank everybody for participating. And please share our Unveiling the Civil War Facebook, YouTube, et cetera. And we want to thank Dylan and Ben for participating. Good work, gentlemen. Love the preparation.
Yeah, thank you guys. You guys put a lot of work into this one. I had a lot of fun during this discussion. So we'll get this one posted. Thank you everyone out there who's still out there listening to us almost 2 hours later. But yeah, please like and subscribe to our YouTube, follow our Facebook page, and listen to us on Spotify. I know a lot of you guys like me have long drives in traffic, so just throw this on and listen to us babble away.
Don't forget your blue tassels on your hats.
That's right. Yeah, everybody make sure you got your hat cords on when you're tuning in next week.
Oh.
Right.
Ben, you have, or Quina, feel better, and unfortunately you can't make it to that Jackson Civil War muster this weekend, but Flower Day, you have fun, and I wish you guys the best in the field.
All right. Take care, guys.
All right. Thank you guys.
Talk to you later. See
All
ya.
right.
Thank you, everyone.